In a merciless desert, the richest man in the region commits an inhuman act. He abandons 4 sick children under the pitiless sun and leaves with disconcerting coldness. The children, sick and now helpless, have no chance of surviving alone until a white horse, silently watching the entire scene, does something unthinkable. Before we begin, if you love animals as much as we do, please subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any emotional stories. Thank you. Now, back to our story. The sun had not yet fully crested the horizon when the clatter of hooves echoed across the courtyard of the most imposing mansion in the entire territory. A stooped figure dismounted with difficulty, her movements betraying her advanced age and the weight of an unbearable sorrow. The old woman held onto the wrought iron gate, her trembling hands leaving marks of cold sweat on the chilled pre-dawn metal. Across the desert, far from that scene of desperation, a white horse suddenly lifted its head. Its nostrils flared, catching something on the wind that shouldn't be there. It wasn't the familiar scent of the dry wind or the scrub brush. It was something different, something that made its heart race with an inexplicable restlessness. The animal shook its mane, its intelligent eyes fixing on the distant town, as if it could see through the miles of sand and rock. Meanwhile, at the mansion, the doorbell rang 3 times before heavy footsteps approached the main door. The man who opened it was tall and elegant, wearing an impeccable suit even at that early hour. His graying hair was perfectly coiffed, and his cold eyes assessed the visitor with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. Clarence Montgomery III, as he liked to be called, was not accustomed to being bothered by common people, especially not at his own home. The woman before him was the complete opposite of everything he represented. Her white hair was disheveled, her simple clothes showing signs of a long and desperate journey. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. In them was a pain so profound that even his hardened heart hesitated for a moment. "Please, Mr. Montgomery," her voice came out as a broken whisper, "I beg you to listen to me. I know it's early, I know I have no right to be here, but I have no one else to turn to." Clarence frowned, his patience already wearing thin. "Ma'am, if it's money you're looking for, you can speak to my administrator in town. He handles such matters." "It's not money," she interrupted, her tears finally overflowing. "It's my grandchildren. 4 small children, sir. They are very sick, and I can't afford the treatment they need." The wealthy man crossed his arms, his expression hardening even more. "And what does that have to do with me?" The question came out so cold that the old woman staggered as if she'd been physically struck. She gripped the doorframe, gathering her strength to continue. Because they are yours, too, Mr. Montgomery. My son worked your land for 15 years. He died last year. And the children's mother, she couldn't bear the grief. I'm all they have now." Clarence remained silent, processing her words. He vaguely remembered the man, a dedicated worker who never caused trouble, but that didn't mean he had any obligation to the family left behind. Far away, the white horse began to pace restlessly in circles. Its owner, a middle-aged woman with dark hair tied in a bun, watched the animal's strange behavior. Margaret had learned to trust her horse's instincts over their years of solitude in the desert. If something was disturbing him this way, there was a reason. "What is it, Tempest?" she murmured, approaching the animal and stroking its neck. "What do you sense out there?" At the mansion, the silence stretched on. The desperate grandmother continued her plea, describing the children's condition, their constant fevers, the cough that wouldn't cease. She spoke of how she had sold everything she owned to afford basic medicine, of the sleepless nights spent caring for the little ones who cried out for their deceased parents. Clarence listened, but his thoughts were already calculating. Accepting responsibility for 4 sick children would be an immense burden, both financially and socially. On the other hand, a public refusal could tarnish his reputation in the community. He needed a solution that would benefit him on both fronts, A cold smile began to form on his lips. "Come in, ma'am," he said finally, opening the door wider. "Let's talk about your children." The interior of the Montgomery mansion was as intimidating as its exterior. Persian rugs covered polished marble floors, and portraits of ancestors stared down sternly from mahogany-paneled walls. The grandmother, who introduced herself as Esperanza Morales, followed Clarence down the main hall, her hesitant steps echoing in the elegant emptiness of the house. Clarence led her to his private library, a room he used to impress visitors and conduct important business. Massive shelves reached to the ceiling, filled with books he had never read, but which conferred an aura of wisdom and respectability. He settled behind his solid mahogany desk, motioning for Esperanza to take an uncomfortable chair on the other side. "Now, Mrs. Morales," he began, steepling his fingers, "I need you to tell me exactly what the situation is with these children." Esperanza took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "There are 4, sir. Maria Elena, who is 8, is the oldest. Then there's Diego, he's 7. Then Carmen, 6. And little Jose, who just turned 5. Her voice trembled as she mentioned each name. "They all have a fever that won't break, Mr. Montgomery. They cough day and night. They can barely eat. The town doctor said they need special medicines, far too expensive for me." As she spoke, Clarence was doing mental calculations. 4 sick children represented significant medical expenses, not to mention food, clothing, and education. On the other hand, his standing in the community depended on being seen as a generous and responsible man. Across the desert, Tempest remained agitated. Margaret had tried to distract him with fresh oats and clean water, but the horse refused both. Instead, he would walk to the fence that bordered her property and stare intently toward the town, his ears pricked to catch sounds she couldn't perceive. "You're worrying me, boy," Margaret murmured, running a hand through his silky mane. "It's been 3 years since I've seen you like this. 3 years. Exactly the time that had passed since she had found Tempest. Wounded and near death, wandering the desert. She had never discovered where he came from, but from the very first day, the horse had shown an extraordinary intelligence and sensitivity. It was as if he could feel the suffering of others, even from a distance. In the mansion, Clarence had made his decision. "Mrs. Morales, I am a businessman, but I also have a heart. These children are, in a way, my responsibility. As their father worked so faithfully for me for so many years." Esperanza's eyes lit up with cautious hope. You will help them." "I will do more than that," Clarence replied, his voice taking on a solemn tone he had perfected over years of negotiations. "I will take full responsibility for them, medical treatment, food, everything they need." Esperanza fell to her knees before the desk, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "God bless you, Mr. Montgomery. You're an angel sent from heaven." Clarence stood, rounding the desk to help her up. "Please, stand up. There's no need for that." His voice was gentle, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "However, there are a few conditions we must establish." "Anything, sir. Anything you ask. First, you must understand that once I assume legal responsibility for these children, they will be under my complete guardianship. This means I will make all decisions regarding their care, education, and future." Esperanza hesitated for only a moment. The thought of completely handing her grandchildren over to a stranger frightened her, but the alternative was watching them wither away from illness. I understand, sir." Second, to ensure they receive the best possible treatment, it may be necessary to take them to specialists in other cities, perhaps for extended periods. You must be prepared to go without seeing them for weeks or even months. This condition was harder to accept. Esperanza felt as if she were being asked to cut out her own heart, but the image of her grandchildren suffering was stronger than her fear. "If it's for their own good, Mr. Montgomery, I accept." Clarence smiled, but there was something predatory in the expression. "Excellent. In that case, I suggest you go and fetch them immediately." The sooner we begin treatment, the better. Esperanza stood up quickly, new energy coursing through her veins. Yes, sir, they are in town, at the house where we are staying. I can bring them today. Perfect. And Mrs. Morales, it would be best if you didn't mention the specific details of our arrangement to anyone. People might not understand the generosity involved and could create unnecessary trouble. Esperanza nodded vigorously. Of course, Mr. Montgomery. I will be discreet. After she left, Clarence remained in his library, staring out the window at the vast desert. His plan was taking shape. He would temporarily assume responsibility for the children, keeping his reputation intact in the eyes of the community. But once the dust had settled and everyone had forgotten about it, he would find a permanent solution to the problem. A solution that would ensure he was never bothered by that family again. Far away, Tempest suddenly grew calm, but his intelligent eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if he were waiting for something terrible yet to come. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange as Esperanza returned to the Montgomery mansion, driving a borrowed wagon that creaked with every movement. In the back, 4 small figures huddled under faded blankets. Even from a distance, one could see the children's fragility, the pallor that contrasted with their feverish cheeks. Maria Elena, the eldest, kept a protective arm around her younger siblings. Her large, dark eyes showed a premature maturity, forged by the necessity of caring for the little ones in the absence of their parents. Diego, right beside her, tried to appear strong, but his labored breathing betrayed the effort each movement cost him. Carmen and Jose, the youngest, dozed restlessly, their small hands intertwined even in sleep. From time to time, a dry cough would wake them, causing them to whimper softly before returning to their troubled rest. Clarence watched their arrival from his veranda, calculating every detail of the scene. He had spent the afternoon preparing one of the guest rooms, not out of generosity, but to keep up appearances. If anyone from town came to visit in the coming days, they would find evidence of his kindness toward the orphaned children. "Mr. Montgomery," Esperanza called as she climbed down from the wagon, "and I've brought my grandchildren, as you asked." Clarence descended the veranda steps with measured strides, his expression carefully composed into a mask of paternal concern. "Of course, Mrs. Morales. Let's see how the little ones are." Maria Elena was the first to climb down from the wagon, helping Diego right after. They both looked up at the imposing mansion with a mixture of awe and shyness. They had never seen a house so grand, so different from the humble cabin where they had grown up with their parents. "Don't be afraid," Esperanza whispered to them. "Mr. Montgomery is a very good man. He's going to take care of you." Clarence approached, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hello, children. Welcome to my home." He crouched down to their level, a gesture he had learned was effective in winning trust. "I hear you haven't been feeling well." Jose, the youngest, hid behind his grandmother's skirt, his large eyes watching the strange man with instinctive distrust. Carmen coughed, a dry hack that echoed in the afternoon air, making Clarence frown genuinely. The children were truly sick, more so than he had imagined. In the solitude of the desert, Tempest raised his head abruptly. Something had changed in the air, a subtle disturbance that only his keen senses could detect. Margaret noticed the horse's immediate reaction. What is it this time, boy?" she asked, approaching him. "You've been acting strangely for days." Tempest walked over to her and, unusually, pressed his muzzle against Margaret's chest, as if seeking comfort or trying to communicate something important. It was a behavior she had never seen before, so human in its need for connection. Back at the mansion, Clarence led the small group inside. The contrast between the opulent elegance of the interior and the rustic simplicity of the children's clothes was stark. They walked close to one another, their small steps echoing in the marble hall. "This will be your room," Clarence announced, opening the door to a spacious room on the second floor. "I hope you'll be comfortable." Maria Elena looked around with wide eyes. There were 2 large beds with clean white linens, more luxurious than anything she had ever seen. A large window offered a view of the mansion's back garden, where a few flowers still resisted the arid climate. "It's very beautiful, sir," she said politely, her voice weak but full of gratitude. "I'm glad you like it," Clarence replied, his patience already beginning to wear thin. "Now, I think it would be best if you rested. Tomorrow, we will begin to properly care for your health." Esperanza kissed each of her grandchildren, whispering words of encouragement and promises that everything would be all right. The tears in her eyes betrayed the anguish of leaving them, but the hope of seeing them cured was stronger than her fear. "Be good," she murmured to Maria Elena. "Take care of each other, as you always have." After Esperanza's departure, Clarence stood in the hallway for a few minutes. Listening to the children's whispers through the closed door, they were talking in low tones, Diego trying to soothe Carmen, who was crying softly for her grandmother. Clarence descended the stairs and went to his office, where he took out paper and ink to write an important letter. He needed to contact an acquaintance in a distant town, someone who could help him with the permanent solution he had in mind for his problem. As he wrote, a cruel smile formed on his lips. In a week, 2 at the most, his reputation would be secure, and he would never be bothered by that family again. Outside, in the silence of the desert night, Tempest remained awake, his ears alert to the distant sounds the wind carried. Something terrible was approaching. He could feel it, and for the first time in his life, the noble animal experienced something akin to human fear. A fear for the fate of innocent souls he had not yet met, but whom he somehow already considered under his protection. The first week at the Montgomery mansion unfolded like a carefully orchestrated play. Clarence hired a nurse from town, Martha Henderson, a middle-aged woman known for her discretion and financial need. She was to care for the children during the day, administer basic remedies, and most importantly, serve as a witness to her employer's generosity. The children seemed to be responding well to the treatment, Martha reported on the 3rd day, finding Clarence in his office. "Their fevers have come down a bit, and they're eating better." Clarence nodded distractedly, his focus on the mail he had received that morning. The reply to his letter had arrived faster than expected. His contact in Eagle Creek, a town a 3-day ride across the desert, had confirmed he could solve his problem for a generous sum. "Mr. Montgomery?" Martha repeated, noticing his distraction. "Ah, yes, Nurse Henderson. Good to know they are improving." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer. "In fact, I've received word from a specialist in childhood diseases who can help them even more. He's in Eagle Creek." Martha frowned. "Eagle Creek? But, sir, that's a very long journey for children in their delicate state. Sometimes the best treatments require sacrifices," Clarence replied, his voice taking on a paternal tone that masked his true intentions. "I'm sure you understand the importance of doing everything in our power for these poor children." In the children's room, Maria Elena had naturally taken on the role of primary caregiver. She helped Carmen take the bitter medicine, told stories to Jose when he cried for his grandmother, and shared her own food with Diego when he had little appetite. "When do you think we'll see Grandma Esperanza again?" asked Carmen, her little voice still hoarse from coughing. Maria Elena hesitated, remembering what Clarence had said about treatments in other towns. "I don't know, Carmen, but Mr. Montgomery said he's taking care of us, so it must be soon." Diego, though younger, had a sharp intuition that made him suspicious of the wealthy man. "He doesn't like us," he mumbled to Maria Elena when they were alone. "You see how he looks at us when he thinks we're not watching." "Don't say that, Diego," Maria Elena chided, but her voice trembled slightly. "He's helping us when he didn't have to. Father always said we should be grateful." Meanwhile, in the desert, Margaret began to notice significant changes in Tempest's behavior. The horse had stopped eating properly and spent hours staring in the direction of the town. Their morning rides, which were always relaxed and exploratory, had become agitated and directional, as if he were searching for something specific. "You're seriously worrying me, boy," Margaret said, stroking the animal's neck. "You've been like this for a week." Tempest turned to her, his intelligent eyes seeming to plead for understanding. For the first time, Margaret had the strange feeling that her horse was desperately trying to communicate with her about something important. At the mansion, Clarence had decided to accelerate his plans. The children's presence was starting to bother him more than he had anticipated. They made noise, they asked questions, and their constant presence in his perfect house was a growing irritation. That evening, he called Martha for a private conversation. "Nurse Henderson, I need you to prepare the children for a journey." "A journey, sir?" "To Eagle Creek. The specialist I mentioned has confirmed he can see them tomorrow. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Martha seemed hesitant. "Mr. Montgomery, with all due respect, the children are still weak. Such a long trip could be dangerous for them." Clarence stared at her coldly. "Nurse Henderson, I expect you to trust my judgment. After all, I am the one paying for the best possible care for these children." His voice carried a subtle threat. "I'm sure you wouldn't want to be responsible for preventing them from getting the treatment they need." Martha looked down, recognizing the impossibility of arguing with her employer. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery, I'll get them ready." Later that night, Maria Elena woke from a nightmare. She had dreamed she was lost in the desert, calling for her parents who never answered. When she opened her eyes, she found José crying softly beside her. "What's wrong, José?" she whispered. "I had a bad dream," he murmured. "I dreamed we were alone, so very alone, and no one was coming for us." Maria Elena hugged him, trying to push away her own growing fears. "It was just a dream, José. We're safe here." But even as she spoke the comforting words, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. There was something in Mr. Montgomery's eyes, something cold and calculating that reminded her of the coyotes that sometimes roamed around their old family cabin. Outside the mansion, hidden by the darkness of night, a figure watched the lit windows of the second floor. Clarence had stepped out to check on the preparations for the wagon he would use the next day, his slow steps revealing the satisfaction of a man whose plan was working perfectly. In a few hours, his problem would be solved forever, and no one could ever blame him for what would happen in the merciless heart of the desert. Dawn arrived with an unusual chill for the region, as if even the weather sensed the unfolding tragedy. Martha woke the children before the sun was fully up, her forced cheerfulness clashing with the anxiety evident in her hurried movements. Come on, little ones," she said, helping José get dressed. "Today you're going on a special trip to see a very important doctor." Maria Elena sat up in bed, watching the preparations with growing unease. "Nurse Martha, why do we have to leave so early? And why isn't Mr. Montgomery coming to say goodbye?" Martha avoided looking the girl in the eye. "He's busy with the travel arrangements, dear. You'll see him before you leave." But that was a lie. Clarence had deliberately avoided the children that morning, fearing his facade of kindness wouldn't hold up under the weight of his true plans. Instead, he watched from his window as Martha led them to the wagon waiting in the courtyard. Across the desert, Tempest was utterly frantic. Margaret had never seen the animal in such a state of turmoil. He ran back and forth in his enclosure, neighing low, his eyes fixed on the direction of the town. When she tried to approach to calm him, he nudged her gently but firmly toward the house, as if wanting to protect her from some unseen danger. "Tempest, what is wrong with you?" Margaret asked, genuinely concerned. "You're scaring me." The horse looked her directly in the eye, and for a chilling moment, Margaret felt he was desperately trying to tell her something. His large, expressive eyes seemed to plead for understanding, for help with something she couldn't grasp. At the mansion, the children were helped into the wagon. Clarence had purposely chosen an old, uncomfortable vehicle, claiming it was the only one available for such a long journey. The back was covered with a canvas tarp, creating a stuffy space where the four children settled as best they could. Diego held Carmen's hand, noticing how she trembled. It wasn't just from the morning chill. "I'm scared," she whispered to him. "Me too," Diego admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. "But we'll stay together, no matter what." Martha climbed into the front of the wagon next to the driver. A thin, silent man Clarence had hired specifically for the task. She didn't know the man, but she had been instructed not to ask unnecessary questions. Finally, Clarence appeared, dressed in his finest suit and maintaining a solemn expression appropriate for the occasion. "Children," he said, his voice laced with false emotion, "I'm sorry I can't accompany you on this journey, but I have urgent business to attend to here. The doctor in Eagle Creek will take very good care of you." Maria Elena leaned out of the wagon. "Mr. Montgomery, when are we coming home?" The question caught him off guard for a moment. "Soon, child, very soon." The lie slipped easily from his lips. "Now go. You mustn't keep the doctor waiting." The driver cracked the reins, and the wagon began to move, its wheels grinding against the stony ground. The children waved from the rear opening of the tarp, and Clarence waved back, holding his smile until the wagon disappeared down the dusty road. As soon as they were out of sight, his smile vanished completely. He pulled out a pocket watch and calculated mentally. Following the instructions he had given the driver, the wagon should reach the designated spot in the desert in about 6 hours. There, far from any witnesses, the man would carry out the second part of his instructions. In the wagon, the children tried to keep busy during the long, uncomfortable ride. Maria Elena told stories her father used to tell, while Diego pointed out interesting rock formations that passed by the opening in the tarp. Jose and Carmen dozed sporadically, their small bodies swaying with the wagon's uneven movement. "The road looks different," Diego observed after a few hours. "This isn't the same one we took from town." Martha, who had been quiet for most of the trip, turned to check. She, too, had noticed they were on a route she didn't recognize, but when she questioned the driver, he claimed to know a shortcut to Eagle Creek. "Don't worry," she told the children, though her own voice betrayed a growing anxiety. "The driver knows these roads better than we do." But as the hours passed and the landscape around them grew more and more desolate, even Martha began to seriously question the trip's true destination. The vegetation had practically vanished, replaced by arid rock and red sand that stretched to the horizon in every direction. At Margaret's ranch, Tempest had stopped eating entirely. He stood motionless at the fence, like a statue of white marble against the golden backdrop of the desert. His muscles were tense, his nostrils flared, as if he were scenting something terrible on the wind. Margaret decided to saddle the horse and try to calm him with a ride, but as soon as she approached with the saddle, Tempest did something he had never done before. He shied away from her, refusing to be ridden, his eyes conveying a desperate urgency. It was as if he knew that somewhere, not too far away, 4 small lives were being led inexorably toward a fate they shouldn't have to face alone. The sun was at its highest point when the wagon finally stopped. The ensuing silence was deafening, broken only by the dry wind that swept the sand into tiny whirlwinds. The children, who had fallen asleep during the hottest part of the day, began to stir at the lack of motion. "Are we there?" Jose asked, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Martha climbed down from the wagon and looked around, her heart sinking as she realized where they were. There was no town in sight, no houses, no people, just miles and miles of desert in every direction. Panic began to rise in her chest as she understood the magnitude of what was happening. "Driver," she called out, her voice trembling. "Where are we? Eagle Creek should be here." The man slowly dismounted from his seat, avoiding her gaze. His nervous hands fidgeted with the reins as he muttered something incomprehensible. It was obvious he was also uncomfortable with the situation, but something was compelling him to follow his orders. "The children need to get out for a bit," he finally said, his voice hoarse with anxiety. Stretch their legs, drink some water. It's still a long trip. Maria Elena was the first out of the wagon, helping her younger siblings down. She immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. There was no road leading anywhere, just wild animal tracks disappearing into the rocky vastness. "Nurse Martha," she said, walking over to the woman. "Where is the town? Where is the doctor?" Martha couldn't answer. Her hands trembled as she opened one of the canteens of water Clarence had provided for the journey. There was only enough water for half a day, perhaps less, under the scorching sun. Diego, ever observant, noticed the growing look of panic on Martha's face. "Something's wrong," he whispered to Maria Elena. "Look how nervous she is." The driver had walked a few yards away, clearly fighting an internal battle. Finally, he returned, his face pale despite his sun-weathered skin. "Mom," he said to Martha, "I have to go back. I have my instructions." "Instructions?" Martha repeated, her voice rising an octave. "What instructions? You can't just leave us here." The man avoided her eyes, already walking back to the wagon. "You are to wait here. Someone will come for you." "Who's coming?" Martha screamed, running after him. "When? We can't stay here with 4 sick children." But the driver was already back on the wagon. With one last, remorseful glance, he cracked the reins, and the vehicle lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of dust that soon dissipated in the dry air. The children watched in absolute silence as their only link to civilization disappeared over the horizon. The sound of the hooves and wagon wheels gradually faded until only the relentless desert wind remained. "Nurse Martha," Carmen said in her fragile little voice, "when is the man coming back for us?" Martha couldn't answer. She looked at the 4 small faces staring up at her with absolute trust, expecting her, the only adult, to know what to do. But the terrible truth was dawning on her. They had been abandoned to die. Far away at the ranch, Tempest suddenly shot up as if struck by lightning. A tremor ran through his entire body, and he began to gallop in circles, his whinnies echoing across the property like a primal lament. Margaret ran out of the house when she heard the sound. "Tempest! What's happening?" The horse ran to her, pressed his muzzle against her shoulder for a moment, and then bolted toward the gate that led to the open desert. He stopped there, looking back as if expecting her to follow. "You want me to go with you?" Margaret asked, her intuition finally beginning to grasp the animal's urgency. "There's something out there, isn't there?" Tempest whinnied low, a sound she had never heard from him before. It was almost as if he were crying. Back in the desert, the children had huddled in the small patch of shade offered by a rock formation. Martha was carefully rationing the water, giving tiny sips to each child, knowing she had to make it last as long as possible. "Let's play a game," Maria Elena said, trying to distract the younger ones. "Let's tell stories about home, about Grandma Esperanza." Jose snuggled up next to her. "Tell the one about when Papa took us fishing in the creek." As Maria Elena told the familiar story, trying to keep her voice cheerful, Diego scanned the horizon in every direction. He had understood, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of crisis, that no one was coming for them. They were utterly alone in the heart of the merciless desert, with enough water for a few hours and no real shelter from a sun that grew more unforgiving with each passing minute. Martha closed her eyes, her tears evaporating before they could even roll down her face. She had been deceived, used as a pawn in a monstrous plan. And now 4 innocent children would pay the price for her naivete. On the distant horizon, a small white figure began to move toward them, but it was still too far away to be seen or heard. Tempest had finally convinced Margaret to follow him, and now they rode desperately against time, guided only by the noble animal's supernatural instincts. The hours passed like an eternity under the relentless sun. Martha had fainted some time ago, overcome by a combination of dehydration and despair. The children huddled around her, Diego trying to shield Carmen and Jose with his own shadow, while Maria Elena moistened the nurse's lips with the last remaining drops of water. "Maria Elena," Carmen whispered, her voice nearly inaudible. "I'm so hot." The older girl looked at her little sister, saw how her cheeks were flushed and her lips were cracked. Jose had stopped crying an hour ago, simply because he had no more tears to shed. Diego kept his eyes closed, conserving energy, but his breathing was growing more labored. "Let's try to sleep for a bit," Maria Elena murmured, though she knew it was dangerous to fall asleep in the heat. "When we wake up, someone will have come for us." She no longer believed the words herself, but she had to keep hope alive for the little ones. In her mind, she began to say the prayers her mother had taught her, asking for a miracle that seemed impossible in this lifeless expanse. It was then that she heard it. A faint, distant sound she first mistook for the wind, but it was rhythmic, steady, like hooves on hard earth. She opened her eyes, trying to focus through the heat haze that distorted the horizon. "Diego," she whispered, touching her brother's shoulder. "Do you hear that?" Diego lifted his head with an effort, his ears pricked. The sound was getting clearer, closer. It was definitely hooves, but just one horse, not a wagon. On the horizon, a figure began to take shape. First just a dark speck against the pale blue sky, then gradually resolving into two silhouettes, a horse as white as snow and a woman with dark hair. Tempest had found his destination. Margaret's heart pounded as she finally spotted the small figures clustered near the rocks. Even from a distance, she could see they were in a critical state. Tempest was neighing softly now, a sound of relief mixed with urgency. "Good boy," she murmured, patting the horse's sweaty neck. "You found them." As they drew closer, Margaret could see the full extent of the tragedy. 4 children and an adult woman, all clearly dehydrated and exhausted, abandoned in the middle of nowhere without water or proper shelter. Her rage at whoever was responsible was instant and profound. "Hey!" she shouted, dismounting quickly. "Are you alive?" Maria Elena lifted her head with an effort, hardly believing what she was seeing. A real woman with a real horse, not a mirage created by heat and despair. "Please," she whispered, "help us." Margaret immediately took out her canteen and rushed to the children. "Slowly," she said, helping Maria Elena take small sips, "very slowly, or you'll get sick." She gave water to each child, then to Martha, who was beginning to regain consciousness. The relief on their small faces as they tasted the cool water was heartbreaking. "How did you end up here?" Margaret asked, as she created additional shade with her jacket. "A man, Mr. Montgomery," Maria Elena managed to say between careful sips of water. "He said we were going to see a doctor, but the driver left us here." Margaret felt her blood boil. She knew Clarence Montgomery by reputation, a rich and powerful man, but she had always suspected something dark lurked behind his respectable facade. Now she had proof. "You are all very brave," she said, gently stroking Carmen's hair, "but you're safe now. My name is Margaret, and this is Tempest. He's the one who found you." Tempest approached the children, lowering his head so they could touch him. Jose, despite his weakness, reached out a tiny hand to stroke the horse's soft muzzle. "He's pretty," Jose whispered. "He's special," Margaret agreed. "He sensed you needed help, even from far away." Martha had regained enough consciousness to speak. "I didn't know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He told me it was for a doctor. I never imagined. It wasn't your fault," Margaret reassured her, though her voice was tight with suppressed anger. "You were deceived too." Margaret quickly assessed the situation. The children were too weak for a long journey right away. They needed rest, more water, and food. Her ranch was a 2-hour ride away, but it would be impossible to take everyone at once on Tempest. "I'll leave you with more water and some food," she decided. "My home isn't far. I'll get a wagon and be back before nightfall." "No," Maria Elena said, grabbing Margaret's sleeve with surprising strength. "Please, don't leave us. The fear in the girl's eyes was gut-wrenching. Margaret understood that these children had just lived through the trauma of being abandoned by an adult they trusted. The thought of being left again, even temporarily, was terrifying to them. "All right," Margaret decided. "Tempest is strong. We'll take everyone together, slowly. Can you walk a little?" she asked Maria Elena. The girl nodded with determination. "I can. For my siblings, I can." Margaret mounted Tempest, then helped Jose up in front of her. Carmen was placed behind, holding onto Margaret's waist. Maria Elena and Diego walked alongside, each with a hand on a stirrup for support, while Martha followed behind, still unsteady but resolute. Thus began the most important journey of Tempest's life, not as an ordinary horse, but as a four-legged angel, carrying hope across the desert toward a new beginning. Margaret's ranch appeared on the horizon, like an oasis of hope after hours of a slow journey through the desert. It was a simple but solid structure, with adobe walls that promised coolness after the relentless heat. A well with a hand pump stood out in the yard, and a few chickens pecked freely near a small barn. "We're here," Margaret announced softly, feeling Jose relax in her arms. The boy had fallen asleep during the second half of the trip, exhausted by the ordeal. Carmen was also dozing, leaning against Margaret's back, while Maria Elena and Diego had walked with a determination that was impressive, refusing to give up. Tempest stopped near the porch of the house, his flanks sweaty, but his posture still proud. He had carried a burden far heavier than the physical weight of the children. He had carried their hopes, their fears, their precious lives through the unforgiving desert. Margaret dismounted carefully, first handing Jose to Diego, then helping Carmen down. The children looked around with a mixture of relief and shyness. After the oppressive luxury of the Montgomery mansion and the terror of abandonment in the desert, this simple house seemed to represent something they had lost long ago, a true home. "Come on," Margaret said, leading them inside. "You need baths, food, and rest." The interior of the house was cozy and functional. Dark wood furniture, simple but clean fabrics, and a scent of wood smoke and herbs that spoke of meals made with love. A large fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by comfortable chairs that seemed to invite long conversations and friendly silences. Martha, who had remained quiet throughout the journey, finally found her voice. "Mrs. Margaret, I don't know how to thank you." "If you hadn't shown up, no thanks needed," Margaret interrupted gently. "Any decent person would have done the same." She paused, looking at the four children who stood close to one another, still in a state of shock. "But now we need to take care of what's important. Nurse Henderson, are you well enough to help me bathe them?" The next few hours were a flurry of gentle, caring activity. Margaret heated water on the wood-burning stove and filled a large basin in the kitchen. One by one, the children were gently washed, their soiled and sweaty clothes replaced with clean shirts Margaret had sewn for herself, which served as comfortable nightgowns for the little ones. During the bath of Jose, the most traumatized of all, Margaret noticed how he trembled whenever an adult moved too quickly. "Hey, little one," she said softly, crouching to his level. "No one is going to hurt you here. You're safe." Jose looked at her with his big dark eyes, still full of fear, but also with a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "You promise?" "I promise," Margaret replied, her heart breaking a little more. "And Tempest promises too. You saw how he took care of you, didn't you?" Meanwhile, in town, Clarence Montgomery was in his office, timing his operation. By his calculations, the children should already be resolved. The driver was supposed to return by nightfall with confirmation that the mission was accomplished. He had prepared his story for when Esperanza inevitably showed up asking about her grandchildren. A terrible tragedy during the trip to Eagle Creek, perhaps a wagon accident, or bandits. He would appear devastated, offer generous condolences, and his reputation would remain intact. Back at the ranch, Margaret had prepared a simple but nourishing soup with vegetables from her garden and fresh chicken. The children ate slowly, their stomachs still sensitive after the ordeal, but each spoonful seemed to restore a bit of life to their pale faces. "This soup is delicious," Maria Elena said politely, her good manners holding up even after all she'd been through. "My mother taught me the recipe," Margaret replied, feeling a pang of sorrow at the mention of her own lost family. She used to say that food made with love heals the body and the soul. Diego, who had remained observant and wary, finally asked the question they were all thinking. "Mrs. Margaret, what's going to happen to us now?" It was a complex question that Margaret had been avoiding fully considering. Legally, the children were still in the custody of Clarence Montgomery. She couldn't just keep them without facing legal consequences, but she also couldn't allow them to return to the man who had tried to kill them. "For now, you're going to stay here," she said carefully. "You're going to rest, get well, and we'll figure out the best path forward together." Martha leaned forward. "I can testify about what happened, about how we were deceived, about being abandoned in the desert. That has to mean something." "Legally, it will," Margaret agreed, her voice hardening slightly. "Clarence Montgomery is going to pay for what he did." That night, after the children had fallen asleep on makeshift beds in the main room, refusing to be separated even for sleep, Margaret went out to tend to Tempest. The horse was in the pasture, grazing peacefully under the moonlight, but his alert eyes showed he remained vigilant. "You did something extraordinary today," she murmured, stroking his neck. "How did you know? How did you sense they needed help?" Tempest pressed his muzzle into her palm, and Margaret again had that strange feeling that the animal understood far more than should be possible. There was something special about him, something that transcended ordinary equine intelligence. As she looked back at the house, where 4 children were finally sleeping safely after days of terror, Margaret made a silent decision. No matter what it cost, no matter who she had to fight, she would protect these children. And Tempest, as if hearing her thoughts, neighed softly in agreement. The sunrise brought a tranquility the children hadn't experienced in weeks. Jose was the first to wake, confused for a moment not to see the elegant walls of the Montgomery mansion, but then remembering the previous day's events. The relief in his small eyes was immediate and profound. Margaret had been awake for hours, preparing breakfast and planning her next steps. She knew she couldn't keep the children hidden forever. At some point, she would have to face the legal system and Clarence Montgomery. But first, they needed to recover fully, and she needed solid evidence. "Good morning, little one," she said softly as Jose appeared in the kitchen, still wearing the large shirt that served as his pajamas. "Did you sleep well?" Jose nodded but approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Margaret, you're not going to send us away, are you?" The simple, direct question touched Margaret's heart in a way she hadn't expected. "No, Jose, you are safe here." One by one, the others woke up. Carmen immediately looked for Maria Elena, who soothed her with a hug. Diego watched everything with his sharp eyes, ever vigilant for signs of danger. Martha woke last, still recovering from the trauma of the day before. Over a simple but nourishing breakfast, Martha finally told the full truth of how she had been deceived. "I should have been suspicious," she said, her hands trembling slightly. "When he insisted so much on the trip, when he wouldn't give me details about the doctor." "You trusted someone who should have been trustworthy," Margaret consoled her. "The fault is not yours." "Nurse Henderson." Maria Elena looked up from her bowl of oatmeal. "Mrs. Margaret, what is Mr. Montgomery going to say when he finds out we didn't die?" It was a perceptive question for an 8-year-old, and it showed that Maria Elena was beginning to understand the magnitude of the betrayal they had suffered. Margaret chose her words carefully. "He will probably invent more lies," she said honestly, "but now we have witnesses to the truth. And the truth always wins in the end." Meanwhile, in town, Clarence was growing impatient. The driver should have returned last night, but there was no sign of him. Clarence paced to his office window, watching the main street with growing anxiety. His concern mounted when he saw Esperanza Morales walking determinedly toward his house. The woman looked more resolute than desperate this time, and it unsettled him. The doorbell rang, and Clarence answered it himself, forcing his most solemn expression. "Mrs. Morales, what a surprise to see you so early." "Mr. Montgomery," Esperanza said, her voice firmer than he remembered, "I've come for news of my grandchildren. How much longer will they be with the doctor in Eagle Creek?" Clarence hesitated. His original plan was to wait for confirmation of the tragedy before telling Esperanza, but now, with no word from the driver, he was improvising. "There have been complications," he said slowly. "The journey was difficult." Esperanza felt a cold knot in her stomach. What kind of complications? At the ranch, Margaret had decided it was time to act. She couldn't remain passive while Clarence was free to spin more lies. "Martha," she said, "do you feel strong enough to ride into town with me?" "What for?" "To tell the sheriff what really happened. To expose Clarence Montgomery for what he truly is." Martha nodded with determination. "Yes, I'm ready." The children grew visibly anxious at the thought of Margaret leaving. "You'll come back?" Diego asked, his voice filled with worry. "We will be back before nightfall," Margaret promised, "and Tempest will stay here with you. If anyone comes who shouldn't be here, he'll know." As if understanding her words, Tempest positioned himself near the porch of the house. Taking a protective stance, his ears were pricked and his eyes were focused on the horizon. The ride to town took 2 hours. Margaret had loaned an older mare to Martha, and they rode in silence for most of the way, each lost in thought about the confrontation to come. The sheriff's office was in the center of town, a small but official building that represented the law in this remote region. Sheriff Jim Patterson was a middle-aged man, known for his honesty, but also for his tendency to avoid conflict with influential people like Clarence Montgomery. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, surprised to see her. "Been a while since you came to town. What brings you here?" "A very serious matter, Sheriff Patterson. This is Martha Henderson, a nurse. She has something important to report." Martha took a deep breath and began to tell her story. She described how she had been hired to care for the children, how she had been deceived about the journey's destination, and how they had been abandoned in the desert to die. The sheriff listened, his expression growing graver by the second. "Those are very serious accusations, Mrs. Henderson. Are you sure there wasn't a misunderstanding?" "Sheriff," Margaret interrupted, her voice thick with controlled outrage, "I found those children in the desert, dehydrated and near death. There is no misunderstanding that can explain that." At that exact moment, the office door swung open and Clarence Montgomery strode in, wearing his finest suit and carrying his authority like a shield. "Sheriff Patterson, I heard there were people in town spreading lies about me." The confrontation Margaret had both feared and expected had finally arrived. Clarence looked at her and Martha with thinly veiled contempt, clearly prepared to use all his influence to discredit their accusations. "Ah, Clarence," the sheriff said, visibly uncomfortable, "I was just hearing a report about the children." Clarence drew himself up to his most imposing height. "Sheriff, these women are obviously distraught over a terrible tragedy. The children I was so generously caring for disappeared during their journey to receive medical treatment. It is a devastating loss for me as well." The ensuing silence was tense and heavy with unspoken emotion. Margaret realized this was the crucial moment. Everything depended on how she and Martha could present the truth against the elaborate lies of a powerful man. The air in the sheriff's office was thick with the tension of the impending confrontation. Clarence Montgomery maintained his haughty posture, confident in his ability to manipulate the situation in his favor. Sheriff Patterson looked visibly uneasy, caught between his duty to investigate the accusations and his fear of confronting the most powerful man in the region. "Sheriff," Clarence began in his most persuasive voice, I deeply regret that these ladies have been deceived by someone pretending to work for me. I am sure they were the victims of an elaborate con." Margaret felt anger boil in her veins. "A con? Mr. Montgomery, Nurse Henderson worked in your house for an entire week. She saw you personally give instructions for the trip." "Impossible," Clarence replied smoothly. "I have never hired this woman. I've never seen her before in my life." Martha stepped forward, her hands trembling with indignation. "How dare you lie like that? I cared for the children in your own home. I know every detail of that place." Clarence eyed her with calculated disdain. "Ma'am, I understand you may be confused after a traumatic experience, but I can prove you were never on my property. My staff can testify that no nurse was hired recently." Sheriff Patterson stroked his beard, clearly conflicted. The word of Clarence against that of two women with no political influence was an unequal battle in a society where power spoke louder than justice. "Where are the children now?" the sheriff asked, trying to find some middle ground. "Safe at my home," Margaret answered firmly, "recovering from nearly dying of thirst in the desert." "Sheriff," Clarence interrupted, his voice taking on a tone of wounded authority, "those children are my legal responsibility. If this woman is holding them against their will, that constitutes kidnapping." The accusation landed like a thunderbolt in the room. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Clarence was using her own compassion against her, turning a rescue into a crime. "Kidnapping!" she repeated, incredulous. "I saved their lives." "According to your version of events," Clarence said coldly. "But I have a different version. The children disappeared during a legitimate medical trip, and now I discover they are being held by a stranger on an isolated ranch." Sheriff Patterson sighed deeply. "Margaret, I'm going to need you to bring the children to town. We need to clear this situation up properly." "No," Martha burst out. "They've barely recovered from the trauma. They can't be exposed to more stress." At that moment, the office door opened again, and Esperanza Morales hurried in, her clothes indicating she had ridden hard to get to town. "Sheriff Patterson," she said, out of breath, "I need to know what happened to my grandchildren. Mr. Montgomery told me there were complications, but he wouldn't give me any details." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Clarence, who for the first time since the conversation began looked genuinely shaken. Esperanza was a witness he hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. Morales," he began carefully, "as I was explaining to the sheriff, there was a terrible tragedy during the trip to Eagle Creek." "What tragedy?" Esperanza asked, her face paling. Margaret saw her chance. "Mrs. Esperanza, your grandchildren are alive and safe. They are at my home, recovering from being abandoned in the desert to die." Esperanza looked from Margaret to Clarence, confusion and hope warring in her eyes. They're alive?" "She is lying to you," Clarence said quickly. "The children disappeared during the trip. It's likely they were kidnapped by bandits." Esperanza approached Margaret, studying her face intently. "You've seen them. You've really seen them." "I've seen them, cared for them, given them water and food," Margaret replied with absolute sincerity. "Maria Elena specifically asked me to tell you they are okay." The name of her eldest granddaughter made Esperanza stagger slightly. No one outside the family knew that Maria Elena always asked to send specific messages to her grandmother. How was she?" Esperanza whispered. "Brave," Margaret answered, her voice softening. "Taking care of her younger siblings, even though she was scared. She has the same strong spirit as you." Clarence realized he was losing control of the situation. "Sheriff, this is clearly an elaborate performance. I demand these women be arrested for kidnapping and extortion." "Extortion?" Sheriff Patterson repeated, confused. "They obviously want money in exchange for the children. It's an old trick, pretending to save children to then demand a reward." Margaret felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. The cruelty and coldness of Clarence in twisting every act of kindness into a crime was breathtaking. Esperanza, however, had made her decision. "Sheriff Patterson, I want to see my grandchildren now, and if this lady says they are safe with her, then that's where I want to go." "Mrs. Morales," Clarence tried to intervene, "you are being manipulated by these criminals." "Mr. Montgomery," Esperanza turned to him with a firmness that surprised everyone, "you told me my grandchildren were dead. Now this lady tells me they are alive. I'm going to find out who is telling the truth." Sheriff Patterson finally made a decision. "We're all riding out to Margaret's ranch. I'll see the children with my own eyes and hear what they have to say. After that, we can determine the facts." Clarence tried to protest, but was overruled by the determination of the others. As they prepared for the ride to the ranch, he quickly calculated his options. His plan had failed spectacularly, but he still had enough influence to shape the narrative in his favor. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, at the distant ranch, Tempest had suddenly raised his head, his nostrils catching a familiar scent on the wind. His eyes turned toward the town, and he neighed low, as if calling someone back home. The ride to the ranch was tense and silent, each member of the party lost in their own thoughts. Esperanza rode beside Margaret, her hands trembling with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Sheriff Patterson maintained a neutral expression, but his eyes betrayed his concern over the complex situation he was about to unravel. Clarence rode behind, his mind working furiously to find a way out of the hole he had dug for himself. As they neared the ranch, Tempest appeared at the fence, neighing loudly as if announcing the visitors' arrival. The children, who were playing in the yard under the shade of a large tree, looked up at the familiar sound. "Grandma Esperanza!" Jose shouted, being the first to recognize the familiar figure. He ran toward the fence, followed by the other three, their voices mixing in exclamations of joy and relief. Esperanza dismounted before her horse had even come to a complete stop, her tears falling freely as she hugged each grandchild with desperate strength. "My babies," she whispered, "my precious little ones. I thought I'd never see you again." Clarence watched the scene with growing unease. The children's genuine joy at seeing their grandmother was undeniable, as was their healthy and well-cared-for appearance. His kidnapping narrative was falling apart before his very eyes. "Grandma," Maria Elena said, grabbing Esperanza's hands, "Mr. Montgomery took us away and left us in the desert, but Mrs. Margaret and Tempest saved us." "Children," Clarence interrupted quickly, forcing a paternal smile, "how good to see you are well. I was so worried when you disappeared during the trip to the doctor." Diego looked at Clarence with an expression that mixed confusion and anger. "Disappeared? You told the driver to leave us there." "Diego," Clarence said in a condescending voice, "you're too young to understand what really happened. Sometimes children make up stories when they're scared." The condescension in Clarence's voice sparked something fierce in Maria Elena. Despite being only 8, she possessed a clarity and determination that impressed everyone present. "I'm not making up a story," she said, her small voice firm. "I remember everything. You said we were going to see a doctor, but the driver took us to the desert and left us there. He said someone would come for us, but no one came. We got so hot and thirsty, and Nurse Martha fainted." Sheriff Patterson knelt to be at the children's level. "Maria Elena, are you sure about what you're saying? It's very important that you only tell the truth." "I am telling the truth," she insisted, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. "Why don't grown-ups believe us? We know what happened to us." Carmen moved closer to her older sister, seeking protection. "The man in the wagon drove away and left us all alone," she said in her fragile little voice. "I was so scared." Jose, the youngest, ran to Esperanza and hid in her skirts. "Grandma, I don't want to go back to that house. Mr. Montgomery doesn't like us." The sincerity and fear in the children's voices were indisputable. Esperanza looked at Clarence with an expression that was both hurt and furious. "How could you do this to innocent children?" "Mrs. Morales," Clarence tried to maintain his composure. These children have suffered a trauma and are confused. They need proper medical care, not to be kept on an isolated ranch by strangers. Margaret stepped forward, her patience finally exhausted. "Sheriff Patterson, I want to show you something." She led the group into the house, where she had kept the clothes the children were wearing when she found them. The garments were caked with sand, stained with sweat and tears, physical evidence of the ordeal they had faced. "These were their clothes when I found them," Margaret explained. "Look at the sand. The state they're in. These children were in the desert for hours, maybe a full day." Martha, who had remained quiet, finally found the courage to speak again. "Sheriff, I can describe every detail of the Montgomery mansion. The office with the bookshelves, the room where the children stayed, the kitchen where I prepared their meals. How could I know these things if I'd never been there?" Clarence realized he was cornered. His lies were contradicting each other, and the evidence was piling up against him. In desperation, he tried one last gambit. "Sheriff," he said, his voice taking on a tone of wounded authority, "I don't know what game these women are playing, but the children are my legal responsibility. I demand they be returned to my custody immediately." It was then that Diego, with his keen intuition, asked the question that changed everything. "If you care so much about us," he said, looking directly at Clarence, "why did you smile when the wagon left? I saw you from the window. You smiled when you thought no one was looking." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. A child's innocent observation had revealed the most devastating truth of all. Clarence had not only planned the abandonment, but had taken satisfaction in carrying it out. Clarence tried to deny it, but his expression had already betrayed the truth. The sheriff looked at the man he had known for years, seeing him in a completely new and disturbing light. "Mr. Montgomery," Sheriff Patterson said slowly, "I think we have a lot to talk about. And this time, it will be in my office, in official custody." The children pressed close to Esperanza and Margaret, finally feeling that the adults were taking their words seriously. Tempest approached the group, as if to offer his own silent protection to the little souls he had helped save. The truth had finally won, but the road to justice was just beginning. The tension at the ranch had reached its peak. Clarence Montgomery, accustomed to controlling any situation with his influence and wealth, found himself for the first time completely exposed and vulnerable. His mask of respectability had fallen away, revealing the calculating coldness that had always existed behind his courteous smiles. "Sheriff Patterson," he tried one last time, but his voice no longer carried the same authority. "Surely you're not going to credit the fantasies of traumatized children over the word of a respected citizen." Sheriff Patterson had known Clarence for over a decade, always respecting him as a pillar of the community. But the evidence before him was irrefutable. The sand-caked clothes, Martha's consistent testimony, and above all, the devastating sincerity of the children had painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. "Mr. Montgomery," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "I'm going to need you to accompany me back to town. There are very serious matters that need to be cleared up." "This is absurd," Clarence exploded, his composure finally shattering. "You're believing lies. I am Clarence Montgomery III. My family built this territory." Maria Elena stepped forward, her small hand holding Esperanza's tightly. "Your family's name doesn't change what you did to us," she said with a maturity that awed everyone. "You left us to die, and that's wrong, no matter who you are." The simple yet profound words of the girl echoed in the ensuing silence. Even Clarence seemed momentarily shaken by the stark truth a child had just delivered. Margaret watched the scene with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in the children's courage to speak the truth, and sadness for the innocence they had lost in discovering that not all adults were trustworthy. Esperanza hugged her grandchildren tighter, silent tears rolling down her face. "My brave little ones," she murmured. "You are braver than many adults I know." Clarence, realizing his situation was untenable, tried a different approach. "Very well," he said, his voice taking on a tone of false resignation. "Perhaps I made an error in judgment. The children were sick. They were a financial burden. I thought it would be better for everyone if they died," Margaret cut in, her voice thick with indignation. "You thought it would be better if 4 innocent children died in the desert?" "I didn't say that," Clarence protested, but everyone could see that was exactly what he had planned. Diego, who had been watching Clarence carefully, made another devastating observation. "You're lying again. I can see it in your eyes. It's the same face you made when you promised you'd take care of us." The 7-year-old boy's sharp intuition was more accurate than many adults could ever be. Clarence Montgomery had been completely unmasked by those he had tried to destroy. Sheriff Patterson took the handcuffs from his belt. "Clarence Montgomery, you are under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder and child endangerment." "Attempted murder," Clarence repeated, his face turning pale. "That's ridiculous. I never tried to kill anyone." "You abandoned 4 sick children in the middle of the desert without enough water," the sheriff explained patiently. "If they had died, it would have been murder. Since they survived, it's attempted murder." As the handcuffs were fastened, Clarence looked around the group. Searching for any sign of sympathy or hesitation, he found none. Even Martha, who had been his employee, regarded him with disgust. "You'll regret this," he said, his last attempt at intimidation. "I have lawyers. I have influence. This isn't over." Jose, the youngest of the children, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "You're a very bad man," he said, with the brutal honesty only small children possess. But we're safe with good people now." Jose's simple declaration perfectly summed up the entire situation. Evil had been exposed and defeated by goodness, courage, and truth. As Clarence was led away, Margaret turned to Esperanza. "What happens now with the children?" Esperanza looked at her grandchildren, then at Margaret. "I don't have the resources to care for them properly. I can barely support myself." She hesitated, then continued in a trembling voice. "Mrs. Margaret, I know it's a lot to ask, but you saved their lives. Could they possibly stay here with you? I would visit as often as I could." Margaret looked at the 4 hopeful little faces turned toward her. Maria Elena, with her precocious maturity and protective heart, Diego with his sharp intuition and observant spirit, Carmen, sweet and resilient despite everything she had been through, and Jose, small but brave, who had faced the worst of humanity and could still trust in good people. "I would love for them to stay," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "This house needs the sound of children's laughter." Tempest approached the group, lowering his head so Jose could pet him. The horse had fulfilled his extraordinary mission, guided by instincts that transcended common understanding. He had saved 4 precious lives and, in the process, had given Margaret a renewed purpose for living. As the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky in golden hues, a new family had formed in the heart of the desert. Not a family united by blood, but by the strongest bonds that exist: love, compassion, and mutual protection. Justice had prevailed, but more importantly, human kindness had triumphed over cruelty, proving that even in the most desolate of places, love can blossom and create miracles. 2 weeks had passed since Clarence Montgomery's arrest, and Margaret's ranch had transformed into something entirely new. What was once the silent refuge of a woman who had isolated herself from grief now echoed with children's laughter, lively dinner conversations, and the comforting sounds of a real family. Margaret was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, when she heard Jose talking to Tempest in the yard. The boy had developed a special connection with the horse. Spending hours telling him his dreams and fears, Tempest would listen patiently, as if he understood every word. "Tempest," Jose was saying, his voice carrying the seriousness only a child can muster. "You are the most special horse in the whole world. Mrs. Margaret said you found us because you have a very big heart." Maria Elena came into the kitchen, carrying fresh eggs from the coop. She had naturally taken on some household responsibilities, not out of obligation, but from a desire to contribute to the home she now considered her own. "Buenos dias, Aunt Margaret," she said, using the affectionate title she had spontaneously adopted. "Good morning, my dear," Margaret replied, smiling at the aunt that warmed her heart every morning. "How are the hens today?" "Henrietta laid 2 extra eggs," Maria Elena reported with the gravity of someone who takes her duties very seriously. "I think she's happy because Diego didn't forget to give them corn yesterday." Diego entered at that moment, carrying kindling for the stove. Though only 7, he had proven to be surprisingly responsible and observant. "Aunt Margaret," he said, "I saw a man riding toward us. Looks like Sheriff Patterson." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and went out onto the porch. Indeed, the sheriff was approaching, but his expression didn't suggest bad news. On the contrary, he looked relieved. "Morning, Margaret," he greeted, dismounting near the house. "Brought some news you'll all want to hear." The children gathered around, curious but no longer afraid of the presence of authority. In the past weeks, they had learned that not all adults were like Clarence Montgomery. Montgomery's trial concluded yesterday, the sheriff announced. He was found guilty on all charges: attempted murder, child endangerment, and a few other things we uncovered during the investigation. Carmen, who was holding Maria Elena's hand, asked timidly, "Does that mean he can't hurt us anymore?" "That's exactly what it means, little one," the sheriff replied gently. "He's going to be in prison for a very long time." The sense of relief that passed through the group was almost palpable. For weeks, despite feeling safe at the ranch, the children had still carried the fear that Clarence might return to finish what he had started. "There's one more thing," the sheriff continued, pulling some papers from his pocket. "Mrs. Esperanza came to see me yesterday. She wants to officially transfer custody of the children to you, Margaret. Said they've found here what she could never offer." Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes. Officially adopting the children was something she had secretly dreamed of, but hadn't dared to mention, afraid of assuming too much. "Does that mean we can stay forever?" Jose asked, his big eyes shining with hope. "If that's what you want," Margaret replied, her voice choked with emotion, "then yes, forever." What followed was an explosion of joy. The 4 children ran to hug Margaret simultaneously, creating a tangle of small arms and happy laughter. Even Tempest seemed to understand the importance of the moment, approaching and lowering his head as if he wanted to join the group hug. That afternoon, after the sheriff had left, the family gathered in the living room for an important talk. Margaret had learned that speaking openly about feelings and fears was essential to healing the trauma the children had suffered. "I want you to know," she began, "that I understand you sometimes still feel scared or sad about your parents. That's normal and it's okay." Diego nodded seriously. "Sometimes I still dream we're lost in the desert, but then I wake up and remember we're here, safe. And it's okay to have those dreams," Margaret reassured him. "In time, they'll happen less." Maria Elena, always the most mature, made a profound observation. "Aunt Margaret, you were lost too, weren't you? Not in the desert, but lost in a different way." The question caught Margaret by surprise. The girl's intuition was astonishing. "Yes, Maria Elena. After my family died, I got lost in my own sadness, but you all helped me find my way back. So we saved each other," Carmen said with her characteristic sweetness. "Exactly," Margaret agreed, smiling through her tears. "Sometimes, the best families are the ones you choose." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, the family settled into their new routine. Diego was helping Jose with his first reading lessons, while Maria Elena taught Carmen to sew simple patches. Margaret watched it all with a deep contentment she hadn't felt in years. Tempest grazed peacefully in the pasture, but his ears remained pricked, ever vigilant over his human family. He had accomplished a mission that transcended his animal nature, guided by a compassion few humans could match. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret went out to say goodnight to Tempest. The horse came to her, gently pressing his muzzle into her palm. "Thank you," she whispered to him, "for bringing me back to life, for giving me a family again." Tempest neighed softly, a sound that seemed to say he, too, had found his purpose. Together, they had created something beautiful from what could have been a tragedy. The scars were still there, in the children's hearts, in Margaret's heart, even in Tempest's sensitive soul. But they were healing scars, transforming from marks of pain into symbols of survival and renewal. The family born of desperation and compassion was now ready to face the future together, knowing they had found in the heart of the desert something more precious than any treasure, an unconditional love that nothing and no one could ever destroy. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the desert, and the transformation was miraculous. The ranch, that once echoed only with the lonely wind, now pulsed with the vibrant energy of a thriving family. Margaret woke each morning to the sound of children's voices planning adventures and sharing responsibilities, a wonderful contrast to the painful silence that had been her companion for so long. On this special Sunday morning, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing a feast. Esperanza was due to arrive in a few hours for one of her regular visits, and the children had insisted on a surprise celebration. The grandmother had become a constant and beloved presence in their lives, finding at the ranch the extended family she had always dreamed of. Aunt Margaret, Maria Elena, appeared in the kitchen, wearing the small apron Margaret had sewn just for her. "The cake is ready for the oven. Diego measured the flour exactly like you taught him." The girl had grown visibly in recent months, not just in height, but in confidence and serenity. The nightmares had become rare, replaced by dreams of the future and endless possibilities. "Perfect, my dear," Margaret replied, watching with pride as Maria Elena became a little chef in her own right. "And where are your siblings?" "Jose is teaching Tempest to count to 5 by stomping his hoof," Maria Elena replied, laughing. "And Carmen is finishing the picture she drew for Grandma." Diego ran in through the back door, his face radiant with excitement. "Aunt Margaret, Tempest did something amazing. He brought a mare who was hurt near the creek. It looks like she had a foal just a few days ago." Margaret dried her hands and followed Diego outside. Indeed, near the barn, Tempest stood beside a brown mare with a small, wobbly foal. The mare looked exhausted and malnourished, but her eyes held the infinite gratitude of a mother who had found help for her baby. "He did that all by himself?" Margaret asked, amazed. "Yes, we saw him guide her here, real slow, making sure the little baby could keep up," Jose explained, his eyes shining with admiration for the horse he considered his best friend. Margaret smiled, watching Tempest gently nuzzle the mare and her foal. The horse's protective, compassionate instinct hadn't faded. On the contrary, it seemed to have expanded to embrace any creature in need that crossed his path. "We'll take care of them," she decided. "Looks like our family is about to get a little bigger." Carmen appeared on the porch, carefully holding a colorful drawing. "I finished Grandma's present," she announced proudly. "It's our whole family together, including Tempest." Margaret knelt to see the drawing, her heart warming. Carmen had perfectly captured the essence of their new life. 5 human figures holding hands in front of a cozy house, with a majestic white horse beside them and a bright sun painted with the most vibrant colors she could find. "It's absolutely beautiful, Carmen. Grandma is going to love it." When Esperanza arrived at noon, riding the borrowed mare she now used for her regular visits, she was greeted with an explosion of joy and hugs. Her grandchildren ran to her, each eager to show off their new skills and accomplishments. "Grandma!" Jose shouted. "I learned to write my whole name. Want to see?" "And I made bread all by myself yesterday," Maria Elena added proudly. During the festive lunch, seated around the wooden table Margaret had extended to accommodate her growing family, Esperanza looked at each face with tears of happiness in her eyes. "When I think of what could have happened," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "and I see you all now so healthy and happy, it's like we've lived a miracle." "It was a miracle," Margaret agreed, glancing out the window where Tempest was grazing with his new equine family. "But it was a miracle we built together with love and courage." Diego, ever the observer, made a profound reflection. "Aunt Margaret, do you think bad things sometimes happen so that good things can happen later?" The question took Margaret by surprise. What do you mean, Diego?" "Well," the boy thought carefully, "if our parents hadn't died, we never would have come here. And if Mr. Montgomery wasn't a bad person, maybe we never would have found you and Tempest. So maybe the bad things brought us to the good things." The silence that followed was full of reflection. It was a perspective too deep for a 7-year-old, yet it revealed a wisdom born of experience and survival. "I think," Margaret said finally, "that you're right. Sometimes life takes us down hard roads to show us where we truly belong." That afternoon, as the children played in the yard and Esperanza rested on the porch, Margaret found herself alone with Tempest for the first time in weeks. She stroked his neck, marveling at how he had become not just the savior of her family, but truly the heart of everything they had built. "You know what you did, don't you?" she whispered to him. "You didn't just save 4 children in the desert. You saved all of us. You brought me back to life." Tempest gently pressed his muzzle against her palm, a gesture that had become his special way of saying he understood and that the love was mutual. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with the golden colors Margaret had learned to associate with hope and new beginnings, she watched her family. Jose was teaching Carmen to skip stones. Maria Elena was helping Diego build a fort out of branches. Esperanza smiled serenely from the porch, finally at peace, knowing her grandchildren had found not just safety, but true love. On the horizon, the distant mountains rose majestically against the colorful sky, a reminder to all that they had traversed the deepest valleys to reach this moment of fulfillment. The desert, which had once represented only desolation and danger, now symbolized resilience and rebirth. Tempest neighed softly, a sound that echoed across the property like a blessing. His adopted mare and her foal drew near, creating a small equine family that mirrored the human family he had helped to form. Margaret smiled, finally understanding that true happiness didn't come from the absence of pain, but from the ability to transform that pain into something beautiful and meaningful. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and rebuilt them into something stronger and more beautiful than anything that had existed before. In the heart of the unforgiving desert, where cruelty had tried to prevail, love had won. A family had been born not of blood, but of choice. A horse had become an angel, and a lonely woman had discovered that sometimes, to find your true family, you first have to be brave enough to open your heart to strangers who become the loves of your life. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, one by one, each point of light seemed to celebrate the quiet miracle that had blossomed in this small corner of the world. And in the sacred silence of the desert night, 5 human hearts and 1 equine heart beat as one, creating a symphony of love that would echo for all future generations.